Katrina, what I really love about this is the guide that it provides, and often just like free roaming conversation. In the past, I've used like stoplight grading. When you get done, is it a red, yellow, or green? You're like green to put them
Hmm.
in the next round. Red, I don't think they match for this role, and then yellow, like I could go either way on this one. Um, or you do like the plus minus, or the which I guess is maybe just another way of doing stoplight grading.
Hmm.
But even in using those, even in coming into an interview process where the search committee members have been trained, like they've taken implicit attitudes tests, they've read
Hmm.
biases, like the 20 bias that'll screw up your decisions. They understand the questions you can and can't ask and why. Even with that, like it's still hard to like separate your bias from that conversation. What I love about the rubric is it like keeps reframing it to ground in those anchors, and
Hmm.
to adapt for that, to adapt for the bias. It doesn't eliminate the bias for it, but it adapts for the bias. And what's really cool about it is that a number of times I've seen how the committee comes in and sort of has their thinking, and then you sort of push on one part of that rubric, and like, oh right, that is what happened. And so you see a shuffling of the candidates in a different way that
Hmm.
realign them with how they individually connect to those KSAs and key anchors, and not what just happens in just life where you start rating them against each other. And
Hmm.
especially when you're like,
Hmm.
who went first because they're anchoring, or do you want to go as a candidate, you want to go last because then you're last in the committee's memory, or you're freshest in the committee's minds. The rubric is that way of just like untangling some of that, and helping clarify the thinking around the decisions that you're making, to adapt for those just like natural tendencies that typically happen when a group of people get together to talk about who you should hire.
I think you're raising a really good point here, Tim, about, when these rubrics get used. And so, after you have an interview, immediately after that interview, while that conversation is fresh, is the time to use that rubric or to fill out that template. Because if you sit until the end, then exactly what you're talking about is happening. You're having that sort of availability bias of the last conversation and then trying to remember everybody else's answers sort of in light of that last answer. And that becomes the benchmark instead of the criteria that you've actually identified for each candidate. So that's one way that we can kind of troubleshoot against that happening, or against that bias, or adjust for that bias, is by asking people to complete that rubric following it, kind of in that hour, if they can, following that interview. And then they give you those scores, or they send those in and submit them. And then you have a chance to look at them. And I would say that, for the first one, it might be really useful to have people submit them to one person. And who that person is one of those things to pay attention to in terms of distribution of power, right? Because you want people to be able to give feedback or to say things that might not be shared, or they might be from their own personal kind of understanding or experience. And so how do you have somebody that's sort of neutral in the process really look at those, so that you can sort of ask questions based on what's there, but actually not necessarily attribute those comments to the people who filled out those forms, because that can also create a really tense dynamic if people feel like they're being called out for giving feedback that isn't actually shared by the rest of the committee. So there's a really delicate way to debrief this, but I think that was something that we really paid attention to in our Upper Philadelphia search, for example, because we knew that committee was representing so many different parts of the hierarchy and functional areas of the organization, and that there were power, historical kind of ways power played out within kind of those roles.
One of the things that's been sort of rolling around in my mind since our conversation was around sort of this 3 interview like framework that we
Mm.
encourage, and sort of the time it takes. And for me, it's been like, how might quote unquote 3 interviews show up in a process that aren't necessarily 3 interviews? And
Mm-hmm.
how might this rubric look differently if you're hiring a CEO versus someone who's not a CEO? And like, how do you
Mm-hmm.
use the same sort of framework but adapt it for carpenters or software engineers or whatever it might be? And I think that's where, because I think that's where a lot of creativity and cross pollination can occur. Oh, you're using that
Mm-hmm.
for that's how you adapt that model for carpenters. Oh, that would be an interesting thing to adapt it for, whatever role. And so these are two things that have been really in my mind, especially as we think, as people mentioned yesterday, it's a hot labor market where like
Mm-hmm.
time is not on the employer side because people have a lot of different options oftentimes. So like how how do you take something that could be a 4-month long process and keep the essence of that thing intact, but use it in a different way that might be lighter weight or faster or whatever, as you're going through the process. And so those are things that I'm really intrigued to just like meditate on for a bit, because I think there's something in that leads to further iteration, that then forms any type of search that you're doing.
Yeah, totally. And one of the things that really struck me yesterday was um, around the comment of the funnel, right? Like if you're getting people just randomly apply or click and apply, and they don't have those basic KSAs that you need, that still takes time in that process. And so, that is also something that um, can add kind of angst to wanting to go through this in an interview kind of a space. And so maybe there's a way of designing a rubric that has as a first step just a way of if it's a screening call where you're not sure if this person has the kind of KSA, like how do you use that space, that 20 minutes, to help you get really quickly clear on whether this person can move into that next round where you might be able to answer some of the other questions you might need for that person. Or you know that connects to another thing that we were thinking about, which is all of these different channels and how to apply and how you track all of those different things, which I think connects to our conversation around the applicant tracking systems. And so I wonder about what's possible there and rethinking how that gets scoped out.
This concept of hurdles in the process, it was what was really on my mind yesterday when we were having that conversation, um, and things that employers might typically ask for: resume, cover letter, 3
Mm-hmm.
references, as a way, especially if they know that they're going to get a lot of applicants, to quickly weed through and pull people out of the process. And I've been a part of this before where I'm like, I know we're going to get 1,000 applicants for one job, one position. And we don't have the time to look at everyone's cover letter or resume in that way. And this was a number of years ago. And I'm look back and like, Tim, what did you do? But one of the things we used as a hurdle was we asked for 3 references, and if people didn't include references, or they said they included the standard line references available upon
Mm-hmm.
request, we kicked them out of the process. And today I look back and think,
Mm-hmm.
God, I mean, how many talented candidates were in that pool that we put a hurdle in there that prevented them from getting into the process? And who was, so it's kind of like false negatives and false positives, like who made
Mm-hmm.
it through that though, that over that hurdle, and who didn't. And so I think that's the tension that I have with, like, we have like real resource issues in organizations and bandwidth issues, and like
Mm-hmm.
we can't oftentimes take 1,000 applicants or 10,000 applicants, but also recognizing there's a lot of great candidates in those pools, and like, what do you do with them? And that's one of the interesting things around, like, I've not used it. I've talked to colleagues who have asynchronous video interviews
Oh
as
yeah,
a
I've used
screener.
those. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, have you?
Mm-hmm.
What did you think? Like, how did it go? How did you use it?
We used them for lots of frontline staff, actually, interviews. And so it was just a way, and they could do it on the phone, on the computer, in any kind of, method that they had available. And it was, we used real, like, there was 2 questions or 3 questions. So it wasn't huge, and it was basically like, help us connect the dots um, to you and this role, and tell us a little bit about whatever this key anchor might be that we were really curious about. And so those were great in that you could watch all of those in a batch, and they were 2 to 5 minutes long, and so you might have spent 20 minutes doing a screening call, but you were getting this information in 5 minutes. Some were really funny, some were really trying to be really formal, and so you got this really interesting mix. And so I often wondered, what is the bias that I'm getting just watching this, because you were watching them so quickly one after another. But it was also, right, like, it was a little bit of an extra step, and so people had to make a little bit of an effort, but they also didn't have to provide all the other stuff. And so I kind of often wondered about, if you're hiring, especially like a high number of, restaurant staff or housekeepers or, facilities folks, and you needed to bring a bunch of people into that process, it was a really great way to invite just little expressions of interest. And that kind of went a long way, right? So I don't know, if we didn't continue to use it. We sort of tried it as a pilot and didn't continue to use it for a bunch of reasons. But it was really intriguing. And I know that the companies that are doing that, like HireVue is one of them, the companies that are doing that are continuing to innovate that process. And so I'd be curious to sort of revisit it or hear if anybody else is using it right now, and how they're sort of interpreting its usefulness or its merit.
I know we're kind of reaching back to previous modules here, but it also aligns with this rubric and how we're weighting. It's something, we mentioned a couple modules ago around the open hiring process that Grayson Bakery and something like Rhino Foods use, where if you put your name on the list, you get a job when it comes up to your name. And so, like, thinking about that and thinking about, like, how could you interview everyone who applies is something that I've been noodling on for years. And it's something when I was at Fracturalis that our people team were really thinking, like, we get 500 applications. How could we interview every single one? And so after I left, they tried the asynchronous videos and said it went really well. And so I think it's an interesting thing. Like, maybe you can't do that, but how do you, I've also known organizations who've done a 5-question quiz, and I'm not sure how that what that would be, but just other ways to try and get the funnel as wide as possible and get that interest, and then also adapt for the bias along the way. So I think you're right. There's a number of different tools out there that are worth experimenting with, and just to see what happens. And then sort of iterate from there. There are a number of tools that also are trying to make it easier, but I think are introducing other hurdles. And so being mindful of it might seem easier, might be easier, but again, from who's included here, who's excluded, in using this tool, and weigh that against your prior process or a traditional process. So I think that's one of the things that's so fun about this, is that there's so many different ways you can approach, and it's going to be bespoke to the role you're hiring for, the organization, your values. But it's a really fun time to be in this process and trying these different things out that ultimately will help you better align your process to the values that you hold in your organization.
Totally. I think one of the things this is making me think about at this point is, we used to go to a bunch of hiring fairs, or we used to go to schools and talk to those folks who are at the apprenticeship phase, or we used to go to industry events and have a presence there. And so there were all of these ways, in the before times, where groups of people in similar work were sort of convening. And I don't know if those are happening, if they're starting up again, if people find them useful. But it was sort of this idea of, instead of making people come to you, as an organization, that there was some legwork there and some like effort there, and you know and sometimes that building relationship in one of those quick conversations or in passing sort of brought a different kind of candidate in. We used to kind of laugh that there was always like, people, and they had their headphones on or their hoods up, and they just wanted to like peruse and kind of, see what was out there without necessarily like putting themselves out there or engaging. um, but at the same time, there were people who stopped to talk, or who would know that they were looking at that there was a few different organizations that were represented there. And I know we also used to do that with certain like international visa clauses that people could bring in. And so we were looking internationally at recruitment programs. We were looking at the kind of career fair kind of spaces, those like conference spaces. We were looking at the training, those like upgrade PD credit kind of pieces that people were doing, and figuring out how do you kind of get a presence in some of those spaces. And so sometimes it was about like, volunteering to give a short presentation, or talk about a career move that somebody in your organization had, and what their journey was, to inspire that like there's lots of ways to get here, or there's lots of ways that people can think about finding at least a temporary home in an organization they might not have considered before.
Yeah, I think that sort of the mix and track, like mix up your ways of connecting, and then track where you're getting people from. Because you talk about like those like fairs, and like that's, I just like get really nervous, because it's like a nightmare to be like in a room with like a lot of people I don't know, and tables, and like, is this conversation going to be
especially
interesting,
now?
or yeah, right. It's like, or am I going to be trapped for 20 minutes and then I can't pivot away from this? And so like, but some people love it, like, and like, so how do you mix these things up, and then try them, and then see what works for specific positions in your organization, and then use that data later, and also maybe even provide, create a rubric for those. Like,
Totally.
here's what we want to get from this, and how successful are we, besides just those sheer numbers that might be, all right, we posted here, we got 200 applications, we went here, no one showed up at our table. Yeah. So I think those are interesting ways to like, I know we sort of went back and sort of coming back again, but interesting ways of using tools throughout the process to rethink what your process looks like.
Yeah, totally. And that's where like taking a developmental evaluation approach is super useful, right? Because you're like, we're going to try something, we're going to get some data, we're going to like figure out what the implications are for us as we go forward, because it will be bespoke, right? We know that much in this moment is that it's not replicable. There's no, I think as Kate said, like there's no silver bullet to this.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Katrina, thanks for the overview of rubrics. And I think that brings our chat here to a close. So we will be with you for module 4, and maybe another bonus video between now and then.